Hi, I'm Mark,
And I'm Melanie.
and today we're going to be talking about evolving flying machines in Minecraft using quality diversity. Our other collaborator, Alejandro, is not going to be presenting with us, and our faculty sponsor was Dr. Jacob Schrum. This presentation contains flashing images and may potentially trigger seizures for those with photosensitive epilepsy.
So, I first want to talk about the motivation for doing this research project. So, there's this open-ended open-endedness challenge that takes inspiration from a lot of the novel creations and builds that Minecraft's players have been known to make, as we can see a few examples here at the bottom. And this challenge makes it so instead of humans creating these works, AI is the one generating it. And we chose flying machines, which we will get into later, because even though it requires such few blocks, the configuration for a successful flying machine is quite complex. And this is proven in a previous attempt, uh, which we will get into a little bit later, that was unsuccessful. And here are some examples of some of the previous work that has been done in Minecraft. We have here at the bottom with this moving image is interactive evolution. Over here at the right, we have an example of World GAN. The little worms, the tree, and the two castles is an example of neurocellular automata. And over here, we have an example of CPPNs and autoencoders. Now, one thing I want to mention is that even though some created structures from scratch, like this one right here, the CPPNs and autoencoders, um, it was not able to generate any flying machines. It only generated static. And those that use the other approaches were able to generate flying structures as well as static structures. However, it was taking in human input, like human made structures, and was not able to do any of this from scratch, which is where our approach differs. And Minecraft is a unique kind of game since it's a 3D sandbox game that has allowed its players to be able to build virtually whatever they would like. And since there are over 150 types of blocks in the game, and the developers are continuing to add um, more and more as years go on, and which has allowed players to come up with lots of different kinds of builds. And one kind of machine that I want to talk about today is the flying machine. Here we have an example of a human designed flying machine. And I want to go over the components since we're going to be talking about it for the rest of the presentation. Here we have two of our moving parts of the flying machine, which are our pistons, sticky and regular pistons. Then we also have a slime block, which is sticky and keeps all the blocks together as it moves in the world. And over here, we have our two power sources. One, which is depicted in our image here, is the redstone block, which is a constant source of power. And over here, we have a observer block, which has a special characteristic as it's able to detect movement with these two little eyes. And upon detecting movement, it is able to activate. However, it should be noted that this is not a constant source like the redstone block. In order to manipulate the blocks within the world using our AI, we use the EvoCraft API. And the creators of the EvoCraft API experimented with different things, like they played around with interactive evolution, which we can see over here. They also played with target based fitness using evolutionary strategy, which their main objective was to have a snake like structure build its way up to this gold block. And as I mentioned previously, they attempted to create flying machines but were unsuccessful for several reasons. They used a fairly simple fitness function, which was based on the change in center of mass. But they were trying to generate massive shapes by neural networks, as we can see here, these two very large machines. Um, but they were very difficult to optimize, and they were also using a pure fitness approach, which makes it really hard to explore the search space. And so from that fitness function that we saw previously, we took that and kind of made tweaks to it in order to improve upon it. So instead of measuring the change in center of mass every few seconds, we measured it every second, and we accumulated this over time, as we can see here in this function right here. It's taking the displacement of the center of mass from one time to another of our shape S. This because of the way that we were accumulating it over time, it lacked a smooth fitness gradient because we were rewarding based on oscillation. There was also a special case for our successful flying machines, which were awarded the max fitness. As we can see here, this flying machine is flying away, but it's leaving a lot of blocks behind, which was an undesirable trait because that means that these blocks are not contributing to overall movement of the machine. So, in order to reduce the amount of blocks being left behind, we deducted zero 0.1 points for every block that was left behind. And in our runs, we saw three kinds of shapes. We saw stationary shapes, which weren't moving at all. We saw oscillating shapes, which had moving parts within them, but were not moving overall. And lastly, we had our flying machines. In order to generate these shapes, we used a real valued vector of 3 values per block in a predetermined 3 by 3 by 3 grid. Each of these values ranged from 0 to 1, and depending on what it was representing, it would change the characteristic of each of these blocks. So block presence meant that if this value was over 0.5, it would be part of the shape. So as we can see here, block 0 is not there because it has a value of 0.4, but block 9 is because it has a value of 0.6. We also have the block type, which each specific range related to a block within our block list. And lastly, we have block orientation, which only matters for a few blocks like the pistons and the observer blocks, since it impacts the overall movement and behavior of our shape, as opposed to the redstone and slime blocks, which don't really matter how you position it in the world.
Now that we've talked about how the shapes have been generated and evaluated, it's time to talk about how they're evolved. They're evolved using the multidimensional archive of phenotypic elites, otherwise known as map elites. The whole idea here is that it uses a quality diversity algorithm which favors diverse genotypes. It simulates niches that are filled with high quality, distinct individuals, and each of these niches are displayed in the archive as a bin, and then the behavior characterization determines what shape goes into each bin, which we'll get to in a second. All of the all of the children shapes are generated via steady state in two different ways. They can either be mutated from one singular bin to create a new child, or we also allow crossover mutation where it takes two bins and then mates them together to create a new offspring. Behavior characterizations describe the aspects of the shape for each individual bin, and the binning scheme uses the behavior characterization to create the structure of the archive. Shapes with similar behaviors map to the same bin, and each bin has the highest scoring individual for that niche. So basically, if a shape is already in the archive and a new shape that scores better than that existing shape is generated, then the new shape will replace it in the archive and generation will continue. In our experimentations, we ran all of our experiments for 30 trials, and we did comparisons between two block sets. The original block set used in the EvoCraft paper, which had two pistons, the redstone block, the slime block, and the quartz block for structure. And then we also made a new observer block set, which just was the exact same block set, but with an observer. To register as a flying machine, shapes needed to vacate a 9 by 9 by 9 area. Pure fitness was compared to the three behavior characterizations that we'll get to in a second, and all of our code is available here on our GitHub. The neat package was used for structure, but the machine learning aspects were not used, and this link will be available at the end of our presentation as well.
So our controlled condition used a pure fitness based approach, which essentially means that we used a mu plus lambda selection, which was applied to a maintained population. This population of mu parents were evaluated, and parents are selected via binary tournament selection in order to create our lambda children. And then these children are created through crossover and mutation. And our best mu members of the combined mu plus lambda population were the ones that survived. And our pure fitness approach was compared to our three other behavior characterizations. So the first was a fairly simple one, which only considered the amount of blocks that made up our shape. And then to add variety, we, along with considering the amount of blocks that made up a shape, we also considered the negative space that was in the shape as well. And as we continued experimenting, we started understanding that the orientation of the pistons was really important and impactful for successful flying machines. So we made a 3D archive that considered the north, south, east, west, and up and down facing pistons for this one.
And then these are our results. So these two graphs show the number of runs that it were able to generate a flying machine. As we can see, the piston orientation did by far the best in both of the block sets, and they did statistically significantly better, um, as they all had a p-value of less than 0.05. The pure fitness actually did surprisingly well in the original block set, doing better than both the count and count negative runs, and it still did comparatively well in the observer block set, but not statistically significantly better. These two graphs show the runs that produced at least one flying machine flying in a given direction. As we can see, the piston orientation was able to generate shapes flying in all four of the cardinal directions as well as the up and down direction in both of the observer and original block sets. This can't be said about any of the other approaches, since in the original block set, all of the other approaches were missing at least one direction when they were generating shapes. And there is also an issue with the observer block because in the EvoCraft API, whenever an observer block is placed is generated into the world, it cannot be generated in the up or down position, even though it can be placed that way in the overworld. So that just shows that with the observer blocks, that still being able to generate so many up and down direction flying machines is very impressive for these approaches. And then these last two sets of graphs are box and whisker plots of the number of generated shapes it took before a flying machine was discovered. The way a box and whisker plot works is that the box is the interquartile range, the whiskers above and below are the upper and lower 25% of the generated shapes, and then any of the dots are considered outliers, like above or below the whiskers. Um, Points beyond the 60,000 mark indicate a failure to generate a flying machine. Uh, Basically, if we let this run for an infinite amount of time, maybe these approaches would all generate flying machines, but we had to cap it somewhere, and we chose 60,000. As we can see, the piston orientation did by far the best in this category as well, where the entire box and whisker plot, other than two outliers, are in the observer block set, are below the 60,000 range. And then in the original block set, up to 75% of the runs were within the 60,000 range. And then the count and count negative approaches did by far the worst. In the original block set graph, we can actually see that any runs that did generate flying machines were considered outliers. Here we have different shapes that were generated in the same run of piston orientation and then in the same run of count negative space. These shapes are flying in completely different directions. The piston orientation are going in the north and east direction, and the count negative space are going in the up and down directions. This is important to point out because when a shape is generated into the world, it does just rotating it 90 degrees or any direction does not guarantee that we have another flying machine that would be flying in that new direction due to quirks within the EvoCraft API. That means that when these shapes are being generated, unique individuals have to be created in order to fly in these different directions. That makes these runs very impressive because completely distinct individuals had to be made. In conclusion, the piston orientation behavior characterization performed by far the best across all the runs. It was able to generate the most flying machines flying in the most different directions, the most reliably. And most importantly, it did better than the fitness-based evolution. In the future, we would like to maybe create flying machines that fly diagonally. As we can see in this bottom right image, the shape sort of shimmies back and forth. It would be interesting if we could consolidate the shimmying so it would fly in a diagonal direction. We would like to try and make larger flying machines. The EvoCraft paper attempted this, and we have colleagues that are currently attempting this as well. But it is very difficult due to the pistons having a limit on how many blocks they can push. And we would also like to try and generate flying machines that maybe split off. As we can see in this middle GIF, the shape sort of goes back and forth before going up. Maybe we could have it so that the shape actually breaks off in two and flies in two completely different directions. This research was made possible by the donation funded Summer Collaborative Opportunities and Experiences, or SCOPE program, for undergraduate research at Southwestern University. All of the source code is once again at that link. Videos and other media are at the second link, or you can also scan this QR code. In the image, we can see our other collaborator, Alejandro Medina, and then any direct questions can go to our professor, Dr. Jacob Schramm.